There are many views of creation that harmonize with science. Then there's historic creation, young earth creation, gap theory, day-age theory, apparent age theory, theistic evolution. All of these reject materialistic evolution. All of them can be harmonized with the creation account. You say, Brett, what's your approach? What's your belief? My approach is that I agree with everybody. You know, you're saying, Brett, that's kind of soft. Yeah, it is kind of soft, to be honest with you. But here's the deal for me. I want what the Bible says, what the Bible intends to say is true. By the way, science doesn't talk. Science is a method. Scientists talk based on what they discover through a scientific method. But what the scientific method actually teaches about the creation is true. The Bible says, as we're going to read in a little bit in Romans chapter 1, God reveals himself through creation. The reason that we can understand creation, the reason we can understand science even, is because God is the creation is rational, logical, because it's created by one who is rational and logical and can be found. But what's difficult, so what the Bible intends to say and what science actually says harmonize. Where we get in trouble is when we try to say things the Bible doesn't intend to say, or we allow science to say things that science doesn't actually say. And so I'm in this kind of position of, I believe the Bible, I believe real science, I'm constantly looking to see how do they all harmonize. Both, I think it was Sir Isaac Newton talked about how we understand God reveals himself through his word and his world. Both reveal God to us. But part of the problem that we have in understanding creation and what is right now and projecting like age of the earth and age of the universe is we have two stories. We talk about this. The Bible shows us that life unfolds in two stories. There's the lower story of humanity, where the story unfolds moment by moment. Scientifically, we would call that processes. And to the degree that all of those processes are consistent over time, you can project onto the past. By the way, one of the things that I heard somebody talk about, scientists recently, is if we live in an expanding universe, as they say we do, what does that mean about the effects of time in our ability to measure the past based on present processes? But at any rate, not only is there a lower story, but there's upper story. And anytime that's where God is at work, and anytime the upper story works in the lower, acts in the lower story, all of a sudden the processes in the lower story, it can't be measured. It's like Jesus feeding the 5,000 or the 10,000. How long does it take you to feed 10,000 people? It would take a long time for me. How long does it take Jesus? It takes Jesus a prayer. You know, so it's one of my geology professor used to say, the earth is as old as there are processes, as young as there is providence and miracle. And so let's just be humble about this. And the reality is that the scientists are not unified, so we shouldn't be divided. In the case for the Creator, a book I would recommend for you, Lee Strobel quotes a PBS show that boldly proclaimed all known scientific evidence supports Darwinian evolution, as does every reputable scientist in the world. Now, that's a bullying sentence. That's not a truthful sentence. It was so unfounded that biologists and chemists and zoologists and physiologists and anthropologists and all kinds of ologists around the world rebelled. They took out a 2-page ad in a national magazine with an article with the banner, "A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism." They were defiant and direct. We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life, they said. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. These were people who signed, like Nobel nominee Henry Schaefer, the third most cited chemist in the world, Fred Figworth, professor of molecular psychology, molecular physiology at Yale Graduate School. I guess if your name is Figworth, you are destined to be an intellect. But at any rate, because you probably got beaten up on the playground. But at any rate, but they broached this, they dared to be politically incorrect, to say the emperor of evolution has no clothes. My point is simply that if the scientific community is not settled on the science, the worst thing that Christians can do is become acrimonious and divisive over it. We just need to be humble to say what the Bible says is true, what true science says is true. Let's try to be honest with what the Bible says and not project what we want it to say, and be honest with what science reveals. I also believe that God created the world because it just is logical. It's the best explanation for what exists. If you've ever taken a logic course, you know Occam's razor. Occam's razor says entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily. In other words, the more complicated the explanation, the less likely it is to be true. Stonehenge. We look at Stonehenge, and what do we think? One of the great mysteries of history that people are constantly asking, what? How did that get there? Who put it there? Friends, it's a bunch of rocks. And nobody says, oh, I wonder how that evolved. Neither does anybody look at it and say, I bet if we come back in 100,000 years, it's going to look like the Eiffel Tower. You know, boy, if we come back in life in 100, it's going to look like, Buckingham Palace. No, it's not reasonable. That's not logical. The Bible says in Romans 1:19, what may be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. Where? How? His invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood through what has been made. As a result, people are without excuse. No one will ever stand before God and say, God, I never had a chance to know you, because God has made himself known through his creation. The way God has made creation is designed to make us say, there's a creator. Not just that, but what kind of creator he is. He is powerful, he is organized, he is orderly, he is logical. And when people refuse to do that, it is because they refuse to love the truth. It's like looking at Stonehenge and saying, how lucky we are that this got here suddenly. I got so many quotes, but I'm running short on time. I love the story of Fred Hoyle, Cambridge professor who went to Caltech with a buddy and tried to figure out how to make carbon. Basically, they said they were having trouble, and then by the end of it, you know what his conclusion was? He's not a Christian, but he looked at his process of creating carbon and came to the conclusion the universe is a put-up job. In other words, it didn't get here by accident. That's absurd. Young people, whenever philosophers, scientists, college, high school teachers try to convince you that Darwinian evolution, that everything got here without God, don't forget the anthropic principle. That everything is here, and it's not by accident. It is finely tuned for life. If any of these, so many different things, if just a little bit out of kilter, human life couldn't exist. And it's absurd to say, well, that's why there's human life, because all of these just perfectly here. You know the implications, by the way, of believing that this is all an accident? The heebie-jeebies about global warming. You know what global warming shows us? This life here is very fragile. And if there's no God, you better be afraid. The amount of matter and energy in the universe is just perfect. Martin Rees says if it were just a coincidence, then it would be a fluke so extraordinary as to make all other cosmic coincidences pale into insignificance. The strong nuclear force of atom, just 5% weaker than only hydrogen would exist in the table, which would make your chemistry class so much easier because the periodic table would just be like this one thing. But we couldn't exist. 2% stronger, only heavy elements would survive. Consider the moon, perfect shape, perfect size, perfect distance. Consider water. You know, water, how important water is for life. If it weren't for water, no coffee, we wouldn't be awake right now, most of us. If the Earth's orbit were 5% closer to the sun, the seas, the rivers, the lakes would all dry up. Farther away, we'd freeze. The entire universe, with all of its laws, appears to be a conspiracy for us. Some people can look at that and say, how lucky we were. But the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim His handiwork to make us say, no, we're not lucky, we're loved. What do you believe? Psalm 14 verse 1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. You have to be, the Bible says this, you have to be a fool to believe we're here without God.